Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning again. It's a great day to be gathered together in the house of the Lord. It's so good to see all of your faces, to be able to stand up here and look out and see everybody's faces. That's just so cool. And for those of you joining us from home, we're glad that you're here this morning as well. I want to begin this morning, though, on a more sober note and address the elephant in the room, if you will. Something that many of you are probably thinking about. I've already heard several people talking about it. I'm deeply saddened and concerned with events I've seen play out in the news recently regarding the death of Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis, which sparked protests nationwide and spilled over into violence last night, even right here in our own backyard. Even more concerning is the comments of Christ followers who have taken to Facebook and other forms of social media to voice their opinions. As this situation continues to play out over the next several days and weeks, I want to give us some practical biblical advice for how we as Christ followers should respond. Number one, as Christ followers, we should note that first and foremost, there's no place for racism in our hearts. If our lives have been transformed by Christ, then that is not an option. In any way, shape, form, or fashion, that's something that should be rooted out of our own hearts. All life has value as being made in the image of God. Period. If you want some biblical examples, just look to today's text. And again, I didn't plan it this way, but just look at today's text. Ruth, who would go on to father or to be the grandmother of King David, and eventually through her the line would go not only through King David, but Jesus himself. Ruth was a Moabite. She wasn't an Israelite. Just sticking to Old Testament examples, Rahab, who's also in that lineage, was a Canaanite. If you remember Joshua's right-hand man, Caleb, the mighty warrior, was a Kenite. He was not an Israelite. And that's just naming a few. There can be no place for racism in the hearts of the church. Number two, we should guard our tongues. Proverbs 15:1-2 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly." In the New Testament, we see in James chapter 1, verses 19-21, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." And this is especially true of what you post online. We must make sure that we are thoughtful and measured in our response anytime that we speak, so that when we speak, that we bring glory to God and not slander or bring shame on His name. Because whatever we say reflects on whom we claim to worship, whom we claim to serve. And then, again, in Colossians 4:6, Paul says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." So number one, there's no place for racism. Number two, guard your tongues. And number three, this does not mean that we should be silent. Just because we should guard our tongues does not mean that we should be silent. Rather, we should always be characterized as people who promote justice. People who promote justice. Why? Because the Lord loves justice. Isaiah tells the people of Judah in Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 16, he says, "Wash yourselves." He's warning them. He says, "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." And again in Micah 6:8, a more familiar passage for many of you, says, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." We must not retreat into our political corners and defend the party line here. This is not the time or the place for that. We desire justice for Mr. Floyd, but we also desire justice for those whose businesses have been destroyed by riots and looting. And we do it all while respecting and submitting to the government authorities. That's how we should be characterized. Let us, as Christ followers, let the church be characterized during this time as men and women of patience, of forgiveness, and who are not afraid to speak the truth to both sides of the aisle, but always doing so in a way that is both loving and gracious. And so I want to start this morning. I want to take a minute. I've asked Justice has agreed to come up and do this for me. But I want to start this morning by just taking a minute to pause and pray for our city, our state, for our leaders, and just for this whole situation.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, we come to you in this just crazy time that we're living in. And God, I just lift up, first of all, our country, and just I pray that your will and your might would be shown throughout this country and all the cities and everything that's going on. And I pray that people would just see your love and see your goodness shine through those that follow you. I pray that we would just see a movement towards that. And God, I pray that we would be that light here in our community. I pray that we would just show your love to those that are around us. And like we were saying, God, just that we would be that word of peace to those that are in our lives. And I pray that that peace would just spread to the community, and that it wouldn't just be something that we keep inside of ourselves, but that is given to other people as well. And through all this, I pray that we do it with love from you and with goodness from you. And I pray that everything we do is meant to shine your light and give you the glory to everything that's around us. And I pray that we would just be strong followers of you. And we just love you so much. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Well, today, hopefully this past week you were able to watch the video on Wednesday night. And if so, then you'll know we're going to jump right in today to the book of Ruth. So if you will, take your Bibles and turn to the book of Ruth. And as you turn there, again, I hope you had a chance to view the context video that I put out on Wednesday, as I'm going to refer back to that periodically. If you didn't, that's okay, but I think you will find it beneficial for your understanding of the book as a whole, as it kind of puts it in its historical context. If you haven't watched it, when you get a minute, it's not very long, but you can find that video as well as the series of messages I preached through the book of Judges on our church YouTube page. But the story is set, just as a refresher, in the time of the Judges, which was in many cases the darkest time in Israel's history. A time when idolatry was rampant, when the people were far from God. And this story offers a reminder that God is always working, even in the midst of stormy circumstances. Every day I'm convinced more and more that this is the message that we need to hear at this time in our nation's history and in the history of this community. So let's begin this morning at the beginning. Chapter 1, verse 1. That's on page 282 of your Pew Bible. Page 282 of your Pew Bible. Alright, so Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Alright, so just setting the stage. There's a famine in the land of Israel. Famine in Israel. Specifically within the territorial allotment of the tribe of Judah. And the story begins with a man, Elimelech, who takes his family and moves to neighboring Moab. Now, Moab, throughout the Bible, is on and off again an enemy of Israel. Thus, this would seem a fairly strange move. Now, there was a recorded period of relative peace between Israel and Moab during, as well as a famine, during the time of the judge Gideon. So it's probable this story takes place around Gideon's time, around that part of the book of Judges. The name Bethlehem, interestingly enough, is translated as house of bread. So it's more than a little ironic that this man and his wife are leaving the house of bread due to a famine. Also, the tribal allotments were given by God. So the tribes, when they invaded the promised land under Joshua's rule, this land they were leaving was land expressly given to them and to their family by God and intended for them to pass it down from generation to generation. Verse 2 refers to them as Ephrathites. Now, what in the world is an Ephrathite? Sounds like a bug or something. If you look in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, we see, let's see if it's going to work. There we go. Micah chapter 5, verse 2. It says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient of days." So, in describing the coming Messiah, Micah again uses this word Ephrathah. So, there's a little bit of debate as to the exact meaning of this term. We know this is a familial name, probably a surname. So most likely it's included here because the original audience would have recognized this family. This would have been most likely a fairly well-known or well-to-do or well-respected or upper-class family, the Ephrathites. So at this point, we feel like, if you're like me, at this point, right off the bat, we feel like we are back in the time of Judges all over again. Here we had, if you will, an anti-type of Moses, a reverse Moses, if you will. Moses leads God's people out of slavery at the hands of God's enemies and into the promised land, while here, just a few generations removed, we have one of God's people leading his family out of the promised land and into the lands of his pagan neighbors. Sounds a lot like what's going on in the book of Judges. As Peter takes his eyes off the Lord and begins to sink at the side of the sea around him, so Elimelech has taken his eyes off the promises of God and instead is focusing on his circumstances. As we often have a tendency to do today, here we have a man who, when times get tough, seeks his security and well-being outside the realm of God's promises. He's willing to trade what God has given in exchange for what he sees as greener pastures in the world around him. Brothers and sisters, before we rush to judgment, do we not often react the same way? In the midst of this pandemic, for example, how many of us measured our security during this crisis? And be honest with yourself. How many of you examined or weighed your security during this crisis by examining our bank accounts or our investments or whether our jobs were considered essential? Having enough money in the bank, well then, okay, I'll be okay. Well, my job's essential. I get to keep working, so at the end it'll all be okay. How many of us actually, the first place we went to look for our security was our bank account? How many of us were all too eager to seek the security of isolation or the security of our homes or seek security in our masks or in our cleanliness? Now, I'm not saying that any of those things are bad or wrong, but ultimately there is no security in those things. All of those things can be taken away. God can make you sick at home or keep you safe in public as you minister to other people. God can provide for the needy or empty the bank accounts of the rich overnight. There is no security in the world apart from the God who controls and ordains the world. Now let's jump back in and continue the story. In verse 3, "But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." Now, part of me wants to ask, what did you expect? What did you expect? Fear of death and suffering leads them to leave the promised land given to them by God, and the result is that they meet an untimely death. And it's interesting to note that the narrator does not explain why they died. He just states that they did die. States it as a fact. Why? Because it's expected. If you walk away from God, bad things are going to happen to you. As we saw with Jonah a couple months ago, running from the Lord never leads ultimately to prosperity. The world can never and will never be able to follow through on all that it promises. Satan is like a salesman who will tell you everything you want to hear and promise you anything and everything he needs to get you to sign that contract. And then when you're locked in, that's when the hidden fees and the clauses begin to emerge. Just a personal story, when I graduated college, I got my first teaching job. Shortly thereafter, Kelly and I bought our first house. We were young and I was dumb. So you see what I did there? Anyway, just pointing that out. Now, that summer, it was the Summer Olympics year. And right after the Summer Olympics, that's the beginning of Razorback football season. So I needed a way to watch the Olympics. I needed a way to watch the game. I don't know why. We all knew what the outcome of those games were going to be. But I found this amazing deal. All right? The local satellite TV carrier, one of the guys in our area, was offering this awesome package, way more than what I actually needed. And it was only $29 a month. Sign this contract, $29 a month, and you get all these channels. I can watch all the games, all the Olympics. That's a great deal, right? So I signed us up in a heartbeat. And what I didn't realize until it was too late was that the contract was for 2 years. The first year was $29 a month, but the second year it was $100 a month. So they charged us 50% the first year, but they charged us 150% the second year. Had I known that up front, I would have gone and watched the game at somebody else's house. In the same way, the world will twist its offer into whatever you want it to be, whatever you want to hear. But it will never be able to follow through. There's always a catch. There's always a price to be paid. And look what goes along with this. As the men leave their God-given land in favor of their pagan neighbors, the sons marry Moabite women. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Deuteronomy 7:3 says pretty specifically, talking to the people as they have come into the promised land, they were supposed to get rid of the inhabitants of the land. It says, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. This was explicitly forbidden. Their lack of trust in God's faithfulness ultimately leads them into other sins as well. And the result is, either we are growing in godliness and holiness, or we are growing in sinfulness. One of the two. Like a vine, sin that's allowed to exist in any area of our lives unchecked will send out runners to compromise other areas of our lives as well. They were expressly forbidden from marrying pagan women. They were given the promised land. They were given a set of moral and ethical laws to live by. And they were not to compromise their standing with God or in the eyes of their neighbors by joining themselves to those who do not recognize the Lord as God. In leaving the promised land for fear of famine, they began to embrace the pagan lifestyle of their neighbors. They began to look just like the people around them. And again, before we rush to judgment, let's note that we often fall victim to the same reaction. When we do not respond to difficult circumstances by trusting in God's faithfulness and standing firm on His promises, then we too begin to look just like the rest of the world. Now, the story now shifts. Elimelech is gone. His sons are gone, and the story shifts to the widow Naomi, who is now alone in a foreign land with nothing and no one save 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. So if you continue on in verse 6. Verse 6 says, Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, see, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Now, Naomi, at this point, is a bitter, broken woman. She decides to return to her God-given homeland as she has recently heard the famine is over and the crops have returned to the land. Surprise! God provided for his people. In the beginning of the story, we see them failing to trust the Lord and walking away from God's promised land into the arms of their pagan neighbors. And now she's leaving her pagan neighbors and returning to the promised land. It's almost a picture of repentance here, of walking away from the world and back to the promises of God. Like the prodigal son looking around at the pigsty and deciding that even scraps from his father's table was better than this. And Naomi releases her two daughters-in-law. They were Moabites. She says, go home, go back to your families. There's a life for you here. Go back and rebuild. Go back and start over. They could remarry. They could have children. They could build a life for themselves. They could be provided for. Single women in that society were at the bottom of the totem pole. So here was a chance for them to make it in life. So she says, go back to your homes, go back to your families, go back to your lands, go back to your gods, go back to the way life was before you ever met me. She's too old to have more children. She's too old to remarry. She has nothing left to offer her daughters-in-law. And she's bitter toward the Lord for how he has dealt with her family. And we'll come back to this bitterness in just a minute, so remember that. Orpah looks around and takes stock of the situation, and she agrees to return. Okay, yeah, you're right. There's no hope for me here. I'm going home, and I'm going to try to make the best of it. Ruth, on the other hand, refuses to leave her mother-in-law. And that's interesting. Up to this point, we know nothing about Ruth. We don't know what her marriage was like. We don't know anything about her previous life. We don't know how much she would have understood about the God of Israel, though obviously she doesn't have great role models in the family that she is married into. But here she makes one of the most profound and beautiful statements found anywhere in the Bible. Let's look at her response, beginning in verse 16. She says, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die and be buried. You see what she's doing here? She pledges herself to Naomi. She swears allegiance to a nation that's not her own. And she swears allegiance to the God of Israel. These sound, if you just read through them, almost like marriage vows. Except for the death part, because she takes it one step further. When Kelly and I got married, I pledged to never leave her for any reason, in sickness or in health, for better or worse, till death do us part. Now, in those vows, that phrase, till death do us part, that is a clause, so that, as the Bible recognizes, if something happens and I were to die, then my wife is free to remarry, free to move on. But Ruth doesn't say that. Here Ruth says, when you die, I will not return. This is still binding. Where you die, I will die. This is not a temporary vow. This is not your average commitment. And for what? All Ruth knows at this point, as far as we can tell, is that Naomi is alone. supposedly without any remaining family, meaning to keep this vow, Ruth is promising, since Naomi has told her that there are no other family members, then Ruth is promising that she is going to commit to Naomi forever, meaning she's not going to be able to remarry, because if she married into a new family, that would violate this vow. That would be leaving Naomi. She's walking away from her homeland. She's walking away from her family in favor of God's people, in favor of the God of Israel, pledging her worship to the Lord, whom she couldn't possibly know that much about. And she does so with a permanent vow. She will live in a foreign land. She's committed to living among foreign people who speak a foreign language, who have a very different culture, with no apparent hope of earthly gain, and there's no going back. Whatever she saw, whatever she understood about the God of Israel, get this, was worth walking away from everything for forever. And she was a Moabite. She is categorically different from anyone we have seen in this story so far because of her character, because she is characterized by faith. And it's a stinging indictment against God's people then, and it should be as well for us today. That it's a Moabite, a foreigner, a pagan, who looks at the God of Israel and walks away from it all. She's marked by a selfless, self-sacrificing love that looks first to the interests of others. Indeed, is willing to sacrifice her own life to tend to someone who is not even her blood kin. At this point in Israel's history, God's people are characterized by their faithlessness, by their untrustworthiness, by their rebellion, by their sinful lifestyles, by their idolatry, looking no different than the surrounding pagan nations. And it is Ruth the Moabite who is different. To be an Israelite reading the story, that would hurt, that would cut deep. And it should cause us to reflect too. Have we taken God's grace and mercy for granted? Are we marked by our love and compassion toward others, or our love of ourselves? Are we marked by our willingness to leave everything to follow the Lord in obedience, or do we look just like the rest of the world around us, the rest of the lost people around us? Let's finish out the story. In verse 19, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Isn't this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Here Naomi returns, and people come out to greet her. She asks them to call her Mara. This seems random, strange. What does this mean? If you'll jump back with me to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. Verse 22, she's referencing a story. She's referencing an event that happened to Moses in the wilderness. They leave Israel and make it through the Red Sea. It says, then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water, and then they came to Marah. And they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? God brought us out of Egypt to what? To let us die of thirst in the wilderness. They complain against Moses. She's referencing this account, this event that happened to Moses as he was leading the people through the desert on their way to the promised land. And the people are complaining because God brought them out of Egypt and now they would all die of thirst. They complained against Moses. They complained against God for his lack of providence. They had no faith. They exemplified no trust in God. Sounds like Naomi. Sounds like a fitting name for her attitude at this moment. She's bitter towards God for the death of her husband, for the deaths of her sons, and for the famine that started this whole thing. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. But you can see the hand of God throughout this entire story. Even in her complaining, there's hope hidden in plain sight. Context is everything. So let's look at the end of that story before we go back to Ruth. Let's finish that story. And how did that story at the waters of Marah end for the people of Israel? And Moses, he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log. He threw the log into the water, and the water became sweet. And there the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and here he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer. God used the bitter water as an opportunity to showcase his love and power and providence for the people of Israel. He uses this bitterness to put himself on display. He uses that bitter water to save his people. It was an opportunity for him to show them that he can be trusted, that he will provide, that he keeps his promises. Maybe that's foreshadowing for those of you who haven't read ahead, something that might happen to Naomi down the road. As chapter 1 draws to an end, I want to highlight 4 conclusions, 4 principles, if you will, that we do well to take note of. How does this apply to us? Number 1, bitterness is blinding. Bitterness is blinding. Look, for example, at verse 21. Naomi says, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Woe is me! Look at my circumstance. God has taken everything from me. I have nothing. I went away full. I came back empty. I came back broken. I came back without anything. God is against me. She's so bitter toward the Lord for the past that she fails to see the present. The Lord brought me back empty. Really? No, Naomi. First of all, the Lord brought you back. You're in the promised land. Second, imagine if you're Ruth and you just pledge your undying loyalty to Naomi and her nation and her God, and Naomi turns around and goes, well, look, I have nothing. No, you have Ruth. You have this daughter-in-law. You have somebody who's here to take care of you, not because she has to, but because she loves you and she chose to. Ruth is a gift. And why did they go back to Israel? Because God removed the famine and has blessed the land. But she sees none of that because of her bitterness. It's so easy for us to fall into the same trap, the trap that bitterness lays. When we surrender to a bitter spirit, we become so focused on our perceived wrongs, our victim status, if you will, that we fail to see everything that God is doing. For example, we can be so scared of this COVID-19 that we fall into despair. Why would God allow this to happen? Life is so bad. Everything is falling apart around us. Well, if you look around, for many, this forced absence from the church has rekindled their love for the Lord and reminded them why church is so important. Also, we've been forced to have an online presence as a church. And that was a major learning curve. And that forced us to do things a lot differently. And it was a big trial and error event, and still is. But it actually increased the number of people that had access to the teaching here that takes place here at Sardis. And it's provided many of you with an easy opportunity to reach out to other people, because it has been very easy for many of you to take that link and reshare it or text it or forward it to somebody who you know maybe they need to hear what was taught. It's provided an easy way for you to share the messages that have been preached with others who may not have had any desire to step foot in a church. And on top of that, and this is something that most of you, in fact, I don't know that any of you really know, but on top of that, during this lockdown, our church has had not one but 2 new professions of faith. When we give in to bitterness, we lose sight of all the good that God is doing all around us. Number 2, God is sovereign. Bitterness is blinding, but God is sovereign. And even Naomi, in her bitterness, acknowledges this. Despite her bitterness and her bad attitude and her poor decisions, she knows ultimately God is the one calling the shots. Her theology may have been imperfect, but it was not absent. Look at verse 13. Would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Look at verse 20. She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. Why? Because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Verse 21, I went away full and the Lord brought me back empty. The Almighty has brought calamity upon me. The Lord has testified against me. She recognizes that God is the author of the calamity that has befallen her. But this is not all. Because in this same chapter, we also see that God is also working for her good in spite of her attitude. Look at verse 6. She arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Look at verse 22. Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. God is the healer of the land, and his timing is perfect. We'll often not understand the works of God in the moment, if we're just being honest. We may never understand why God allows certain things to happen. We may never understand why God causes us to have to deal with certain events in our lives. But this story is evidence of the fact that our inability to see his purpose doesn't mean there is no purpose. As I thought about that this week, I decided to title this series, if you've seen it on the sign, Tragedy, Romance, and the Myth of Chaos. Chaos is defined as a lack of order or structure. What the story of Ruth shows, and we'll see this more in the coming weeks, is that by that definition, there's no such thing as chaos. Circumstances may look disordered, they may look unstructured, they may look like they lack purpose, but the appearance of chaos only means that we can't see what God is doing. It does not mean that he's not doing. It does not mean that he's not working. Never forget that he is always working. Number 3, bitterness is blinding. God is sovereign, and God's providence is often hard. God's providence is often hard. It's one thing to call out the bitterness in Naomi's heart, and her heart attitude is sinful. It's quite another to pretend that her life has not been hard. She has suffered much in life up to this point. No matter whose fault it was or whatever sin may have started it, we have to acknowledge that she has suffered in life. Ruth has as well. She's lost her husband, and she's now moving to a foreign land to live as a beggar. It's important to remember that God's will is ultimately not about your earthly comfort. His providence is often hard. The Bible never says that life will be easy. In fact, obedience to the Lord comes at a cost. Following the Lord often means making difficult changes in life. Often means making difficult sacrifices in life. Often means the inability to conform to what your lost friends or your lost relatives may be doing, or what the lost you used to do. Jesus himself encourages his followers to count the cost before agreeing to follow him. Which poses the question, what is he worth to you? What's he worth to you? The reality is there's nothing in this world worth holding on to at the cost of living in rebellion against the Lord? Nothing. Which leads me to number 4. Past sin does not negate present hope. Just look at verse 22. Look at verse 22, the very last sentence of this chapter. It says, "And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest." After everything Naomi's family has been through, they re-enter Israel right as the barley is ripe for harvest. Coincidence? No way. God has provided. In spite of it all, God has provided. And spoiler alert, God will continue to bless Naomi. And it is ultimately through Ruth that the line of King David and ultimately Jesus the Messiah will come about. So the point there is, if you are still breathing, it is not too late. You are not too broken. You've never sinned too often or sinned too great to return to the Lord in repentance and receive forgiveness. If you know that you're not walking with the Lord today, if you know you're walking in sin, then I would encourage you to not leave here without pulling myself or Pastor Mark aside. We would love to sit down and share a meal or some coffee or something with you and discuss what it looks like to surrender to the Lord and be forgiven. That gift of grace that's freely offered to all who are willing to, as Ruth did, to walk away from it all. As we close, often it is said, and I've said it as well, that God uses the unlikely. That God uses the underdog. God likes the underdog. God uses the ordinary. But I've been convinced this week that that's not entirely accurate. It has nothing to do with the unlikely or the underdog or the ordinary. At the end of the day, God uses the obedient. God uses the obedient. Let's close today by going to the Lord in prayer. As we get ready to dive into the rest of this book, Heavenly Father, as we get ready to look at the rest of this story of Ruth and how you work in and through this dark, depressing time in the nation of Israel's history, as you work through the social dysfunction and the idolatry and the rampant wickedness that is spread throughout your people, God, as we look at how you are continuing to work, how you are continuing to move and shake and guide your will to come about. Lord, help us to take it to heart as we face our own dark days, our own social instability, our own idolatry, our own cultural idolatry. Lord, when it looks like our nation is running from you as fast as it can, and as we mourn the wickedness in our society all around us, Lord, help us to not give in to despair, because just as you did with Ruth, God, we know you're still at work. Even when we can't see your will and how it fits, God, we know that everything fits exactly the way you want it to. Everything is part of your plan. Lord, help us to be faithful and let you worry about the results. Whatever may come, whatever happens to me, Lord, whatever you bless me with, whatever you take away from me, Lord, I pray that I and my family would serve the Lord. As Joshua posed to his men, choose you this day whom you will serve. Lord, help my answer to always be, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. No matter the cost, no matter the price. Lord, we thank you for the grace and mercy that you've shown us, that you've showered, that's all around us. For the goodness that we've seen, even in the difficulty, even in the sickness, God, we've seen that you're still working, that there is still good. And Lord, we praise your name for that. Lord, help us to have eyes to see what's going on. Help us to have hearts that are compassionate, that desire to reach out. But Lord, ultimately, let us trust our lives in your hands. Lord, may we walk in a way that we live however many days you've given us as an example to people around us of what it looks like to follow you, of what it looks like to love you, of what it looks like to serve you wholeheartedly. Lord, help us to leverage our lives for the sake of your kingdom, for the sake of the gospel. Lord, we thank you again for everything that you've done. We thank you for the story of Ruth, that there is hope in the darkness, that there really is no such thing as chaos. Lord, help us find comfort and strength and encouragement in that. And Lord, I thank you again for the time that we have to spend in your word the next few weeks. Lord, help us to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And as the praise team comes to close us in song, Lord, help us to lift our voices and sing. Help us to lift our voices and praise your name for what you've done, for who you are, and for the fact that you are worthy of worship, you're worthy of praise. We pray that our worship of you this morning would be pleasing to your ear. And it's in Christ's name that we pray.